I think that the importance behind the excavation programme in 2007 was the site itself, because this is the epicentre of the O'Neill lordship in the medieval period. And then in the aftermath of the medieval period, where you've got the plantation, it becomes a landscape that's owned by Sir Arthur Chichester, who's one of the architects of the plantation. So you've got this site which is associated with two of the Titan characters in Ulster in the period from 1590 up through to 1610. And these two individuals had a huge influence on the shaping of modern Ulster. So there's the fact that this was the centre of the O'Neill's lordship, that this was where power was held by this major lineage, this dynasty that ruled for 300 years. And then the fact that it becomes a centre of the new political dispensation in the period after the plantation. What you're dealing with is, it was a political hub before the plantation. It was the political hub of the O'Neills. But what you often find, and we see it elsewhere at places like, for example, Donegal and Donegal Castle, where you have Sir Basil Brooke coming in, and he uses Donegal Castle as his base. And it's the replacement of one power with another power, but taking over the headquarters of the previous powerful rulers of an area and stamping your own authority on that region by taking over their headquarters. This was the centre of political power in Ulster for, as I say, about 300 years, because you have the two main lineages in Ulster at the time. You have the O'Donnells and you have the O'Neills, and there's great rivalry between the two. The O'Donnells over in Donegal, they would see themselves as being the most powerful lineage. The O'Neills here in mid-Ulster would have viewed themselves as the most powerful lineage. So there's a lot of friction between the two, and there's an awful lot of conflict between the two groups over that 300-year period. But whoever you decide was the most powerful, who was the better, it doesn't remove you from the fact that this was the epicentre of power for one of the two major lineages in Ulster. And probably that was one of the reasons why Chichester wanted to get his hands on this site, to make sure and emphasise that power had changed. This was no longer the O'Neills in charge, this was the new order. The new order had come in, and the old castle of the O'Neills, that was now in the hands of a new man, and a very powerful new man, Sir Arthur Chichester. Well, I suppose we first arrived on the hill in the weeks before Time Team for that initial walkover. And we'd done geophysics. By chance we had done geophysics, as they were at that time, the Environment and Heritage Service. The government archaeologists had requested that we did a geophysical survey for them on the hilltop. So we'd done that, and my colleague at that time, Ronan McHugh, had led that survey. So that had given us an indication of the scale and scope of what there was up here, because you have to remember that while this was always known as the centre of O'Neill power, and that there was a castle here, this had been an RUC and British Army facility, and you didn't get access to it. So it was only really at that period from about 2003, 2007, where access was starting to be granted as it became the council's property, and we were starting to see around the sites. So we had in our head that, Robert Chappell had done a series of small-scale test trench excavations when there was a new security compound being constructed for a telecommunications tower. And Robert had encountered, this is right up on the top of the hill, Robert had encountered walls within his small trenches, but you couldn't be sure what it was that he had encountered. We just knew it was mortared walls. And the trenches were like 1.50 metre by 2 metres. They were tiny, and there was great depth to the stratigraphy they encountered. But we knew there was something there. So it meant that when we came onto the hill, what we were trying to do was identify an area that we could excavate, where we would get results. And I suppose you mentioned that, was it daunting? I think all archaeological excavations, there's an element of trepidation when you go out onto a site and you start excavating, because you don't know what you're going to find, and you might find nothing. I think the pressure that was on us was that we had Time Team with us, and there was an awareness that this had been a huge operation for them to come across. There was the time pressure that this was being done in 3 days, and it really was done in 3 days. Would we find anything? And that was, I suppose, at the back of our heads when we came up onto the hilltop on that Monday morning for the first time to do a walkabout with Time Team who had come across. The work started on the Tuesday, continued on the Wednesday and the Thursday, and then Friday was packing up. So yeah, there was a sense of trepidation. There was that concern, are we going to actually find anything? Is this going to be, every season of Time Team there were programs where they didn't find things, but you just didn't want this to be one of those programs where you didn't find anything. As it happened, by the end of the first day, we knew we had come down pretty much onto structural evidence, and that sort of took the pressure off. It was then trying to work out what was the structures that we had encountered, and by the second day and certainly by the third day we had managed to do that as well. Robert Chappell's excavations in 2003 had revealed mortared walls. He'd come down onto the top of the walls, but he wasn't able to excavate any further, and they were tiny test trenches. Robert had looked at them and had thought that they might have been associated with some sort of BOM, defended enclosure. So whenever we started revealing the walls up on Trench 1 at the top of the hill, there was that thought that maybe this is the BOM that we're excavating inside the defended enclosure. By day 2, whenever we had revealed the upper surface of the wall, the first wall that came through, it was 1.5 meters thick. Now that's a big wall, and you wouldn't expect to get a BOM wall. A defended enclosure wall would not be as thick as that. And I remember there was about 50 people up on the hill. There was 20 archaeologists from Queen's, and there were about 30 from the Time Team. So this was a hive of activity. And what would happen was there was like periods of shooting where they'd be filming, and then there'd be periods of excavation. And the periods of excavation were pretty frantic, and the periods of shooting were very quiet. But you'd be taken off to a part of the site for filming purposes, maybe Trench 2 or Trench 3. And then you'd make your way back and see what had been done in your absence at Trench 1. And I remember coming back onto Trench 1, and the guys, my colleagues from Queen's, had revealed the upper surface of the wall. And I remember looking at it and thinking to myself, I have seen this before. And it took me maybe about 5-10 minutes looking at it and thinking, and then it came back to me. I did my doctoral study on Tower House castles in County Limerick. And you go out in the morning and you'd go to the sites that you're intending to do your survey at that day. But nobody had been to these sites for so long that you didn't know what was waiting for you when you arrived there. And sometimes you would go and the castle had been knocked down. Now, it might have been knocked down in 1870 or 1920, but very often the last vestiges were still there, the foundations. And I realised that what I was looking at in the trench was the same as those foundations that I'd looked at when I was doing my work in Limerick. It was the foundation wall of a tower house, and it had the right thickness. It was about 1.5 metres thick. That in itself doesn't clinch the matter. What clinched it was then as we got into day 3 and we started clearing down that wall face. Because most of the stone, the cut stone on the outer and inner wall face had been removed. Somebody had robbed it of its nice cut stone. Except at the very, very bottom of our trench where we were excavating, where it was revealed the cut stone was still in place, and it became obvious that what you had was base batter. And the base batter, which is basically the sloping of the wall upwards, it's a feature that is diagnostic of a tower house. It's a feature that's common across the island at tower houses. So when we had this great big thick wall and it had a base batter and the cut stone pieces of that base batter were still in situ, then we knew it was the tower house wall. The other element of the story, of course, was the Chichester military fort. And again, we knew that Chichester had built something on the hilltop. We knew this because we had the various government surveys, 1611, 1619, 1622. And we also had a pictorial map by a guy called Nicholas Pinner from 1624. So we knew there was something up there that Chichester had built. What he had built, we weren't quite sure, but Pinner's little pictorial drawing of the site showed the tower surrounded by a military fort. And the military fort was square, rectangular in shape, and at each corner it had a spear bastion. When we started the excavation, we'd found the wall of the tower house, and then we found this other stretch of wall, and we followed that. And this was all been done at quite a heavy, fast speed. And we identified that what we had was a bastion. We had a spear-shaped bastion. So now we had the two elements of the story. We had a spear-shaped bastion where we knew from the historical map that there was a spear-shaped bastion, and we also had the tower house wall where we knew that there was a tower house. So you're then able to start using that structural evidence to plot what it was going on up at the top of the hill. Well, tower houses are a class of small castle that originate around about 1400, and they continue in use for about 200 years. They're built across the island of Ireland. They are very popular. They tend to be associated with the minor landowners as well as great magnates, both Anglo-Irish and Gaelic lordships. And I suppose the essence of the tower house is the fact that all of the rooms, all of the elements within the building are stacked one on top of the other up through the building, and then communication between the different floor levels is by a spiral staircase. So they're quite simple. They're very elegant buildings. They would have been maybe 4-5 stories high. They could have had a thatched roof, or they could have had a shingle roof, or even a slate roof. But they're self-contained units, residential units. They're not citadels, they're defended homes. And if you think of the nature of Irish society at this time, there's no central government. So that means there's no police, there's no army, standing army. So it's left to the power of the individual lordships to look after themselves, and it's left to the individual landowners to look after themselves. So if you think about it in that sense, it means that a tower house gives you and your extended family security. It means that you can go in there on a winter's night and close the door and you're safe. And you've got associated with it a bawn, a defended enclosure, where you can take in the cattle. And the cattle are safe. So they're popular, but the thing to remember is that to be able to have 2,000 to 3,000 of these built across the island in the 200-year period from 1400 to 1600, there was wealth in the country. So you have this period of stability, and you have agricultural activity, primarily pastoral agriculture and the cattle. And that is generating the wealth, and the wealth is then being used to build these tower houses. The castle here, if you think of its location, right on top of this hill, and when people go out there and they've got the viewing platforms, they can see right the way across the countryside. They can see for miles. If you are, let's say, 10, 15, 20 miles away, you can look up and you'll see Castle Hill, and on top of Castle Hill you will see that symbol of the O'Neill lordship, and that is this tower house castle, the O'Neill Castle. It stands out in the landscape. It tells you that there's a powerful ruler in this area, and that's their home. So it serves that purpose of being a home for the O'Neill, but it also serves the purpose of being a status symbol and a symbol of their prestige across the countryside, that people can see this is the centre of the O'Neill lordship. And how do we know they're very powerful people? Because they've got a great big massive tower sitting up on top of the hill. What Chichester is doing is he's coming in and he's imprinting himself onto that pre-existing power structure. He's putting the new political system in place, and he is the new ruler. So by going and taking the Castle Hill and the O'Neill Castle and building his new fortification around it, he's sending out a message as well. He is a great man. He is the new power. He's occupying the old centre of power because he can occupy the old centre of power because he's a very powerful man. I think if you look at what we did in 2007, it's a scheduled area, so it has got protection. And it means that whenever we were looking to get the excavation licence to undertake the field work, the government archaeologists allowed us to do it, but they restricted us to a 6 metre by 6 metre trench. That was the area roughly that we were allowed to excavate. So 6 metres by 6 metres, you know, that sounds quite a lot, but when you actually go up to that hill, top of that hill, and you look at an area of 6 metres by 6 metres, it's not actually that much, bearing in mind also that there was like 2 metres of overburden that had been put in place by the army, and that tapered in the actual amount of space that we had to excavate for health and safety reasons. So it was a keyhole exercise. It was a very successful keyhole exercise, and you know, the gods were with us because, you know, we came down right on the best possible place that we could have hoped to have excavated. We got the tower house, we got the military fort, but it was keyhole. It was limited in scale, and I think what, you know, if you were wanting to do further excavation, I think what you'd want to do is return to that trench 1, and you'd want to open up a bigger area. Now, there is a question there of why you would want to do that, because it's safe. The site is safe, as I say, it's scheduled. But I suppose the only reason I think you would want to do that is to actually open up the area, expose the walls, consolidate the walls, and present the walls to the public so that people can see for themselves these walls associated with the two buildings. There's photographs, there's plenty of plans of what was done on the excavation, but for visitors, I think that the immediacy of what was there isn't quite as obvious. A photograph doesn't really do it. So that's a big project. That is not a small scale project. There would be a lot of engineering elements to that. It's more than just, an archaeological excavation. There would be a lot of, the whole topography of the top of the hill would need to be looked at and considered. But I don't think there's any point in doing any small scale interventions. I think you either just leave it, we know what it's there, we know it's safe, or you go to the next stage, which is to actually reveal the walls and have that as at the heart of the tourist and local people, the experience that they have when they come up to the hill.